By the time he'd gone slowly through 7 of the 8 purses, savoring their contents, it was 7:15 in the evening, and Billy was euphoric. He breathed fast and occasionally shuddered ecstatically. His oily hair looked oilier than usual, for it was damp with sweat and hung in clumps and tangles. Perspiration glimmered on his face. During his exploration of the purses, he knocked the open Doritos off the kitchen table, but didn't notice. He opened a second beer, but he never took a taste of it. Now it stood warm and forgotten. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of a woman's purse. Billy had saved the crazy old woman's bag for last, because he had a hunch that it was going to provide the greatest treasure of the day. The hag's purse was big, almost a satchel, made of supple black leather, with long straps, and with a single main compartment that was zippered shut. He pulled it in front of him and stared at it for a while, letting sweet anticipation build. He remembered how the crone had resisted him, holding fast to the bag until he thought that he might have to flick open his switchblade and cut her. He had cut a few women before. Not many, but enough to know that he liked cutting them. That was the problem. Billy was smart enough to realize that, liking knife play so much, he must deny himself the pure pleasure of cutting people, resorting to violence only when absolutely necessary. If he used the knife too often, he would be unable to stop using it, would be compelled to use it, and then he would be lost. Although the police expended no energy in the search for mere purse snatchers, they would be a lot more aggressive and relentless in the pursuit of a slasher. Still, he had not cut anyone for several months, and by such admirable self-control he should have earned the right to have some fun. He would have taken enormous pleasure in separating the old woman's withered meat from her bones. Now he wondered why he had not ripped her up the moment that she had given him trouble. He had virtually forgotten how she'd briefly terrified him, how she had looked less human than avian, how her bony hands had seemed to metamorphose into wicked talons, and how her eyes had blazed. Deeply confirmed in his macho self-image, he had no capacity for any memory that had the potential for humiliation. With a growing certainty that he was about to find a surprising treasure, he put his hands on the purse and lightly squeezed. It was crammed full, straining at the seams, the mother of all purses, and Billy told himself that the forms he felt through the leather were wads of money, banded stacks of $100 bills. His heart thumped with excitement. He pulled open the zipper, looked in, and frowned. The inside of the purse was dark. Billy peered closer. Very dark. Impossibly dark. Squinting, he could see nothing in there at all. Not a wallet, or a compact, or a comb, or a packet of Kleenex, not even the lining of the purse itself. Only a flawless and deep darkness, as if he were peering into a well. Deep was the word, all right, for he had a sense that he was staring down into unplumbable and mysterious depths, as if the bottom of the purse were not just a few inches away, but thousands of feet down, even farther, countless miles below him. Suddenly, he realized that the glow from the overhead fluorescence fell into the open purse but illuminated nothing. The bag seemed to swallow every ray of light and digested it. Billy Neek's warm sweat of quasi-erotic pleasure turned icy, and his skin dimpled with goose flesh. He knew that he should pull the zipper shut, cautiously carry the purse blocks away from his own house and dispose of it in someone else's trash bin. But he saw his right hand slipping toward the gaping maw of the bag. When he tried to pull his hand back, he could not, as though it were a stranger's hand, over which he had no control. His fingers disappeared into the darkness, and the rest of his hand followed. He shook his head. No, but still he could not stop himself. He was compelled to reach into the bag, and now his hand was in all the way to the wrist, and he felt nothing in there, nothing but a terrible cold that made his teeth chatter. And still he reached in and down until his arm was shoved all the way into the elbow. He should have felt the bottom of the purse long before this, but there was just a vast emptiness in it. So he reached down farther, until he was in almost to his shoulder, feeling around with splayed fingers, searching in that impossible void for something, anything. That was when something found him. Down deep in the bag, something brushed his hand. Billy jerked in surprise. Something bit him. Billy screamed and finally found the will to resist the siren call of the darkness in the purse. He tore his hand out and leaped to his feet, knocking over his chair. He stared in astonishment at the bloodied punctures on the meaty portion of his palm, tooth marks. 5 small holes, neat and round, welling blood. At first, numb with shock, he at last let out a wail and grabbed for the zipper on the purse to close it. Even as Billy's blood-slicked fingers touched the pull tab, the creature climbed out of the bag, ascending from a lightless place, and Billy snatched his hand back in terror. The beast was small, only about a foot tall, not too big to crawl out through the open mouth of the purse. It was gnarly and darkish, like a man in form, 2 arms, 2 legs, but not like a man in any other way at all. If its tissues had not once been inanimate lumps of stinking sewage, then they had been a sludge of mysterious though equally noxious origins. Its muscles and sinews appeared to be formed from human waste, all tangled with human hair and decaying human entrails and desiccated human veins. Its feet were twice as large as they should have been, and terminated in razor-edged black claws that put as much fear into Billy Neeks as his own switchblade had put into others. A hooked and pointed spur curved up from the back of each heel. The arms were proportionately as long as those of an ape, with 6, or maybe 7 fingers. Billy could not be sure how many, because the thing kept working its hands ceaselessly as it crawled out of the purse and stood up on the table, and each finger ended in an ebony claw. As the creature rose to its feet and emitted a fierce hiss, Billy stumbled backward until he came up against the refrigerator. Over the sink was a window, locked and covered with greasy curtains. The door to the dining room was on the other side of the kitchen table. To get to another door that opened onto the back porch, he would have to go past the table as well. He was effectively trapped. The thing's head was asymmetrical, lumpy, pocked, as if crudely modeled by a sculptor with an imperfect sense of human form, crafted from sewage and scraps of rotten tissue, as was its body. A pair of eyes was set high on that portion of the face that would have been the forehead, and a second pair blinked below them. 2 more eyes, making 6 in all, were located at the sides of the skull, where ears should have been, and all these organs of vision were entirely white, without iris or pupil, so the beast appeared to be blinded by cataracts. But it could see. Most definitely it could see, for it was looking straight at Billy. Trembling violently, making strangled sounds of fear, Billy reached to one side with his bitten right hand, and he pulled open a drawer in the cabinet next to the refrigerator. Never taking his eyes off the thing that had come out of the purse, he fumbled for the knives that he knew were there, found them, and extracted the butcher knife. On the table, the 6-eyed demon opened its ragged mouth, revealing rows of pointed yellow teeth. It hissed again. "Oh, God," Billy said, pronouncing the second word as if it were in a foreign language, its meaning not quite clear to him. Twisting its deformed mouth into what might have been a grin, the demon kicked the open can of beer off the table and let out a hideous, dry sound halfway between a snarl and a giggle. Suddenly, lunging forward and swinging the big butcher knife as if it were a mighty samurai sword, Billy slashed at the creature, intending to lop off its head, chop it in half. The blade connected with its disgusting flesh, sank less than an inch into its darkly glistening torso, above its knobby hips, but would not go any deeper, certainly not all the way through. Billy felt as if he had taken a hack at a slab of steel, for the aborted power of the blow coursed back through the handle of the knife and shivered painfully through his hands and arms, like the vibrations that would have rebounded upon him if he had grabbed a crowbar and, with all his strength, slammed it into a solid iron post. In that same instant, one of the creature's hands moved, flash quick, slashed Billy, revealing 2 of his knuckle bones. With a cry of surprise and pain, Billy let go of the weapon. He staggered back against the refrigerator, holding his gouged hand. The creature on the table stood unfazed, the knife embedded in its side, neither bleeding nor exhibiting any signs of pain. With its small, black, gnarled hands, the beast gripped the handle and pulled the weapon from its flesh. Turning 6 scintillant, milky eyes on Billy, it raised the knife, which was nearly as big as the beast itself, and snapped it in 2. It threw the blade in one direction and the handle in another. Billy ran. He had to go around the table, past the creature too close, but he did not care, did not hesitate, because his only alternative was to stand at the refrigerator and be torn to bits. Dashing out of the kitchen into the bungalow's dining room, he heard a thump behind him as the demon leaped off the table. Worse, he heard the click-tick-clack of its chitinous feet and horny claws as it scrambled across the linoleum, hurrying after him. As a purse-snatcher, Billy had to keep in shape, and had to be able to run as fast as a deer. Now, his conditioning was the only advantage he had. Was it possible to outrun the devil? He bounded out of the dining room, jumped over a footstool in the living room, and fled toward the front door. His bungalow was isolated between an empty lot and a transmission repair shop that was closed at this hour of the evening. A few houses stood across the street, however, and at the corner was a 7-Eleven market that was usually busy. He figured that he would be safe. If he was with other people, even strangers, he sensed that the demon would not want to be seen by anyone else. Expecting the beast to leap on him and sink its teeth into his neck, Billy tore open the front door and almost plunged out of the house, then stopped abruptly when he saw what lay outside. Nothing. No front walk. No lawn. No trees, no street, no other houses across the way, no 7-Eleven on the corner, nothing. Nothing. No light whatsoever. The night beyond the house was unnaturally dark, as utterly lightless as the bottom of a mine shaft, or as the inside of the old hag's purse, from which the beast had clambered. Although it should have been a warm, late April evening, the velvet black night was icy, bone-numbingly cold, just as the inside of the big, black leather purse had been. Billy stood on the threshold, swaying, breathless, shaken by his jackhammer heart, and he was seized by the mad idea that his entire bungalow was now inside the crazy old woman's purse, which made no sense. The bottomless purse was back there in the kitchen, on the table. The purse could not be inside the house at the same time that the house was inside the purse. Could it? He felt dizzy, confused, nauseous. He had always known everything worth knowing, but thought he did. Now he knew better. He didn't dare venture out of the bungalow into the unremitting blackness. He sensed no haven within that coldly gloom, and he knew instinctively that if he took one step into the frigid darkness, he would not be able to turn back. One step, and he would fall into the same terrible void that he had felt within the hag's purse. Down and down forever. Down. A hiss. The beast was behind him. Whimpering wordlessly, Billy Neeks turned from the horrifying emptiness beyond his house, looked back into the living room where the demon was waiting for him, and cried out when he saw that it had grown bigger than it had been a moment ago. Much bigger. 3 feet tall instead of 1, broader in the shoulders, more muscular arms, thicker legs, bigger hands, and longer claws. The repulsive creature was not as close as he had expected, not on top of him, but standing in the middle of the small living room, watching him with predatory interest, grinning, taunting him merely by choosing not to end the confrontation quickly. The disparity between the warm air in the house and the freezing air outside generated a draft that sucked the door shut behind Billy. It closed with a bang. Hissing, the demon took a step forward. When it moved, Billy could hear its gnarly skeleton and oozing flesh work one against the other, like the parts of a grease-clogged machine in ill repair. He backed away from it, heading around the room toward the short hall that led to the bedroom. The repugnant apparition followed, casting a hellish shadow that was somehow even more grotesque than it should have been, as if it were thrown not by the monster's malformed body, but by its more hideously malformed soul. Perhaps aware that its shadow was wrong, perhaps unwilling to consider the meaning of its twisted silhouette, the beast purposefully knocked over the floor lamp as it stalked Billy, and in the influx of shadows it proceeded more confidently and more eagerly, as if darkness greased its way. At the entrance to the hallway, Billy stopped, edging sideways, bolted flat out for his bedroom, reached it, and slammed the door behind him. He twisted the latch with no illusions of having found sanctuary. The creature would smash through that flimsy barrier with no difficulty. Billy only hoped to reach the nightstand, where he kept a Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum, and indeed he got it, with time to spare. The gun was smaller than he remembered. He told himself that it seemed inadequate only because the enemy was so formidable. The weapon would prove plenty big enough when he squeezed the trigger, but it still seemed small, virtually a toy. With the loaded .357 held in both hands and aimed at the door, he wondered if he should fire through the barrier or wait until the beast burst inside. The demon resolved the issue by exploding through the locked door in a shower of splinters and mangled hinges. It was bigger still, more than 6 feet tall, bigger than Billy, a gigantic and loathsome creature that more than ever appeared to be constructed of filth, wads of mucus, tangled hair, fungus, and a putrescent bits and pieces of cadavers. Redolent of rotten eggs, with its multiplicitous white eyes, now as radiant as incandescent bulbs, it lurched inexorably toward Billy, not even hesitating when he pulled the trigger of the .357 and pumped 6 rounds into it. Who or what had that old crone been, for God's sake? She was no ordinary senior citizen, living on Social Security, paying a visit to her butcher shop, looking forward to bingo on Saturday night. Hell no, no way! What kind of crazy woman carried such a strange purse and kept such a thing as this at her command? What kind of bitch? What kind of bitch? A witch? Of course. A witch. At last, backed into a corner, with the creature looming over him, the empty gun still clutched in his left hand, the scratches and bites burning in his right hand, Billy really knew for the first time what it meant to be a defenseless victim. When the hulking, unnameable entity put its massive saber-clawed hands upon him, one on his shoulder, one on his chest, Billy peed in his pants, and was at once reduced to the pitiable condition of a weak, helpless, and frightened child. He was sure that the demon was going to tear him apart, crack his spine, decapitate him, and suck the marrow out of his bones. But instead, it lowered its malformed face to his throat, and put its gummy lips against his throbbing carotid artery. For one wild moment, Billy thought it was kissing him. Then he felt its cold tongue lick his throat from collarbone to jawline, and he felt as if he'd been stung by 100 needles. Sudden and complete paralysis ensued. The creature lifted its head and studied his face. Its breath stank worse than the graveyard odor exuded by its repellent flesh. Unable to close his eyes, in the grip of a paralysis so complete that he could not even blink, Billy stared into the demon's maw and saw its moon-white, prickled tongue. The beast stepped back. Unsupported, Billy dropped limply to the floor. Though he strained, he could not move a single finger. Grabbing a handful of Billy's well-oiled hair, the beast began to drag him out of the bedroom. He could not resist. He could not even protest, because his voice was as frozen as the rest of him. He could see nothing but what moved past his fixed gaze, for he could neither turn his head nor roll his eyes. He had glimpses of furniture past which he was dragged, and he could see the walls and the ceiling above over which shadows cavorted. When he rolled onto his stomach, he felt no pain in his cruelly twisted hair, and thereafter he could see only the floor in front of his face and the demon's clawed black feet as it trod heavily toward the kitchen where the chase had begun. Billy's vision blurred, cleared, blurred again, and he thought his failing sight was related to his paralysis. Then he understood that copious but unfelt tears were pouring from his eyes, streaming down his face. In all his mean and hateful life, he had no memory of having wept before. He knew what was going to happen to him. In his racing, fear-swollen heart he knew. The stinking, oozing beast dragged him rudely through the dining room, banging him against the table and chairs. It took him into the kitchen, pulling him through spilled beer over a carpet of scattered Doritos. The thing plucked the old woman's huge black purse from the table and put it on the floor within Billy's view. The unzippered mouth of the bag yawned wide. The demon was noticeably smaller now, at least in its legs and torso and head, although the arm, with which it held fast to Billy, remained enormous and powerful. With horror and amazement, but not with much surprise, Billy watched the creature crawl into the purse, shrinking as it went. Then it pulled him in after it. He didn't feel himself shrinking, but he must have grown smaller in order to fit through the mouth of the purse. Still paralyzed, and still held by his hair, Billy looked back under his own arm and saw the kitchen light beyond the purse, saw his own hips balanced on the edge of the bag above him, tried to resist, saw his thighs coming in, then his knees. The bag was swallowing him. Oh, God, he could do nothing about it. The bag was swallowing him, and now only his feet were still outside, and he tried to dig his toes in, tried to resist, but could not. Billy Meeks had never believed in the existence of the soul, but now he knew that he possessed one, and that it had just been claimed. His feet were in the purse now. All of him was in the purse. Still looking back under his arm, as he was dragged down by his hair, Billy stared desperately at the oval of light above and behind him. It was growing smaller, smaller. Not because the zipper was being drawn shut up there, but because the hateful beast was dragging him a long way down into the bag, which made the open end appear to dwindle the same way that the mouth of a turnpike tunnel dwindled in the rearview mirror as one drove toward the other end. The other end. Billy could not bear to think about what might be waiting for him at the other end, at the infinitely deep bottom of the purse, and beyond it. He wished that he could go mad. Madness would be a welcome escape from the dread that filled him. Madness would provide sweet relief. But evidently part of his fate was that he should remain totally sane and acutely aware. The light above had shrunk to the size of a small, pale, oblate moon riding high in a night sky. It was like being born, Billy realized, except that this time he was being born out of light and into darkness. The albescent moon-form above shrank to the size of a small and distant star. The star winked out. In the perfect blackness, many strange voices hissed a welcome to Billy Neeks. That night in late April, the bungalow was filled with distant, echoey screams of terror from so far away that, although carrying through every room of the small house, they did not reach the quiet street beyond the walls, and did not draw any attention from nearby residents. The screams continued for a few hours, faded gradually, and were replaced by licking, gnawing, chewing sounds of satisfied consumption. Then silence. Silence held dominion for many hours, until the middle of the following afternoon, when the stillness was broken by the sound of an opening door and footsteps. "Ah!" the old woman said happily, as she stepped through the kitchen door and saw her purse standing open on the floor. With arthritic slowness she bent, picked up the bag, and stared into it for a moment. Smiling, she pulled the zipper shut. Twilight of the Dawn.
"Sometimes you can be the biggest jackass who ever lived," my wife said the night I took Santa Claus away from my son. We were in bed, but she was clearly not in the mood for either sleep or romance. Her voice was sharp, scornful. "What a terrible thing to do to a little boy." "He's 7 years old. He's a little boy," Ellen said harshly, though we rarely spoke to each other in anger. For the most part, ours was a happy, peaceful marriage. We lay in silence. The drapes were drawn back from the French doors that opened onto the second-floor balcony, so the bedroom was limned by ash-pale moonlight. Even in that dim glow, even though Ellen was cloaked in blankets, her anger was apparent in the tense, angular position in which she pretended to seek sleep. Finally she said, "Pete, you used a sledgehammer to shatter a little boy's fragile fantasy. A harmless fantasy, all because of your obsession with—" "It wasn't harmless," I said patiently, "and I don't have an obsession." "Yes, you do," she insisted. "I simply believe in rational—" "Oh, shut up." "Won't you even talk to me about it?" "No, it's pointless." I sighed. "I love you, Ellen." She was silent a long while. Wind soughed in the eaves, an ancient voice. In the boughs of one of the backyard cherry trees an owl hooted. At last, Ellen said, "I love you too, but sometimes I want to kick your ass." I was angry with her because I felt that she was not being fair, that she was allowing her least admirable emotions to overrule her reason. Now, many years later, I would give anything to hear her say that she wanted to kick my ass, and I'd bend over with a smile. From the cradle, my son, Benny, was taught that God did not exist under any name or in any form, and that religion was the refuge of weak-minded people who did not have the courage to face the universe on its own terms. I would not permit Benny to be baptized, for in my view that ceremony was a primitive initiation rite by which the child would be inducted into a cult of ignorance and irrationality. Ellen, my wife, Benny's mother, had been raised as a Methodist, and still was stained, as I saw it, by lingering traces of faith. She called herself an agnostic, unable to go further and join me in the camp of the atheists. I loved her so much that I was able to tolerate her equivocation on the subject. Nevertheless, I had nothing but scorn for others who could not face the fact that the universe was godless, and that human existence was nothing more than a biological accident. I despised all who bent their knees to humble themselves before an imaginary Lord of creation, all the Methodists and Lutherans and Catholics and Baptists and Mormons and Jews and others. They claimed many labels, but in essence shared the same sick delusion. My greatest loathing was reserved, however, for those who had once been clean of the disease of religion, rational men and women like me, who had slipped off the path of reason and fallen into the chasm of superstition. They were surrendering their most precious possessions, their independent spirit, self-reliance, intellectual integrity, in return for half-baked, dreamy promises of an afterlife with togas and harp music. I was more disgusted by the rejection of their previously treasured secular enlightenment than I would have been to hear some old friend confess that he had suddenly developed an all-consuming obsession for canine sex and had divorced his wife in favor of a German Shepherd bitch. Hal Sheen, my partner with whom I had founded Fallon and Sheen Design, had been proud of his atheism too. In college we were best friends, and together we were a formidable team of debaters whenever the subject of religion arose. Inevitably, anyone harboring a belief in a supreme being, anyone daring to disagree with our view of the universe as a place of uncaring forces, any of that ilk, was sorry to have met us, for we stripped away his pretensions to adulthood and revealed him for the idiot child that he was. Indeed, we often didn't even wait for the subject of religion to arise, but skillfully baited fellow students who, to our certain knowledge, were believers. Later, with degrees in architecture, neither of us wished to work with anyone but each other. So we formed a company. We dreamed of creating brawny, yet elegant, functional yet beautiful buildings that would delight and astonish, that would win the admiration of not only our fellow professionals but the world. And with brains, talent, and dogged determination, we began to attain some of our goals while we were still very young men. Fallon and Sheen Design, a wunderkind company, was the focus of a revolution in design that excited university students as well as long-time professionals. The most important aspect of our tremendous success was that our atheism lay at the core of it, for we consciously set out to create a new architecture that owed nothing to religious inspiration. Most laymen are not aware that virtually all the structures around them, including those resulting from modern schools of design, incorporate architectural details originally developed to subtly reinforce the rule of God and the place of religion in life. For instance, vaulted ceilings, first used in churches and cathedrals, were originally intended to draw the gaze upward and to induce, by indirection, contemplation of heaven and its rewards. Under-pitch vaults, barrel vaults, grain vaults, fan vaults, quadripartite and sexpartite and tierceran vaults are more than mere arches. They were conceived as agents of religion, quiet advertisements for him and for his higher authority. From the start, Al and I were determined that no vaulted ceilings, no spires, no arched windows or doors, no slightest design element born of religion would be incorporated into a Fallon and Sheen building. In reaction, we strove to direct the eye earthward, and by 1,000 devices to remind those who passed through our structures that they were born of the earth, not children of any god, but merely more intellectually advanced cousins of apes. Hal's reconversion to the Roman Catholicism of his childhood was, therefore, a shock to me. At 37, when he was at the top of his profession, when by his singular success he had proven the supremacy of unoppressed, rational man over imagined divinities, he returned with apparent joy to the confessional, humbled himself at the communion rail, dampened his forehead and breast with so-called holy water, and thereby rejected the intellectual foundation on which his entire adult life to that point had been based. The horror of it chilled my heart, my marrow. For taking Hal Sheen from me, I despised religion more than ever. I redoubled my efforts to eliminate any wisp of religious thought or superstition from my son's life, and I was fiercely determined that Benny would never be stolen from me by incense-burning, bell-ringing, hymn-singing, self-deluded, mush-brained fools. When he proved to be a voracious reader from an early age, I carefully chose books for him, directing him away from works that even indirectly portrayed religion as an acceptable part of life, firmly steering him to strictly secular material that would not encourage unhealthy fantasies. When I saw that he was fascinated by vampires, ghosts, and the entire panoply of traditional monsters that seemed to intrigue all children, I strenuously discouraged that interest, mocked it, and taught him the virtue and pleasure of rising above such childish things. Oh, I did not deny him the enjoyment of a good scare, because there's nothing essentially religious in that. Benny was permitted to savor the fear induced by books about killer robots, movies about the Frankenstein monster, and other threats that were the work of man. It was only monsters of satanic and spiritual origins that I censored from his books and films, because belief in things satanic is merely another facet of religion, the flip side of God worship. I allowed him Santa Claus until he was 7, though I had a lot of misgivings about that indulgence. The Santa Claus legend includes a Christian element, of course. Good Saint Nick and all that. But Ellen was insistent that Benny would not be denied that fantasy. I reluctantly agreed that it was probably harmless, but only as long as we scrupulously observed the holiday as a purely secular event having nothing to do with the birth of Jesus. To us, Christmas was a celebration of the family and a healthy indulgence in materialism. In the backyard of our big house in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, grew a pair of enormous, long-lived cherry trees, under the branches of which Benny and I often sat in milder seasons playing checkers or card games. Beneath those boughs, which already had launched most of their leaves to the tugging hands of autumn, on an unusually warm day in early October of his 7th year, as we were playing Uncle Wiggily, Benny asked if I thought Santa was going to bring him lots of stuff that year. I said it was too early to be thinking about Santa, and he said that all the kids were thinking about Santa and were starting to compose want lists already. Then he said,
"Daddy, how's Santa know we've been good at bed? He can't watch all us kids all the time, can he? Do our guardian angels talk to him and tattle on us, or what?"
"Guardian angels?" I said, startled and displeased. "What do you know about guardian angels?"
"Well, they're supposed to watch over us, help us when we're in trouble, right? So I thought maybe they also talk to Santa Claus."
Only months after Benny was born, I had joined with like-minded parents in our community to establish a private school guided by the principles of secular humanism, where even the slightest religious thought would be kept out of the curriculum. In fact, our intention was to ensure that, as our children matured, they would be taught history, literature, sociology, and ethics from an anti-clerical viewpoint. Benny had attended our preschool, and by that October of which I write, was in second grade of the elementary division, where his classmates came from families guided by the same rational principles as our own. I was surprised to hear that in such an environment he was still subjected to religious propagandizing. Who told you about guardian angels?
Some kids.
They believe in these angels?
Sure, I guess.
Do they believe in the tooth fairy?
Shh, no.
Then why do they believe in guardian angels?
They saw it on TV.
They did, huh?
It was a show you won't let me watch.
And just because they saw it on TV, they think it's true? Benny shrugged and moved his game piece 5 spaces along the Uncle Wiggily board. I believed then that popular culture, especially television, was the bane of all men and women of reason and goodwill, not least of all because it promoted a wide variety of religious superstitions and, by its saturation of every aspect of our lives, was inescapable and powerfully influential. Books and movies like The Exorcist and television programs about guardian angels could frustrate even the most diligent parent's attempts to raise his child in an atmosphere of untainted rationality. The unseasonably warm October breeze was not strong enough to disturb the game cards, but it gently ruffled Benny's fine brown hair. Wind Musk, sitting on a pillow on his redwood chair in order to be at table level, he looked so small and vulnerable. Loving him, wanting the best possible life for him, I grew angrier by the second. My anger was directed not at Benny, but at those who, intellectually and emotionally stunted by their twisted philosophy, would attempt to propagandize an innocent child.
Benny,
I said,
listen. There are no guardian angels. They don't exist.
It's all an ugly lie told by people who want to make you believe that you aren't responsible for your own successes in life. They want you to believe that the bad things in life are the result of your sins and are your fault, but that all the good things come from the grace of God.
It's a way to control you.
That's what all religion is. A tool to control and oppress you. He blinked at me.
Grace who?
It was my turn to blink. What?
Who's Grace? You mean Mrs. Grace Keever at the toy shop? What tool will she use to press me?
He giggled.
Will I be all mashed flat and on a hanger when she's done pressing me? Daddy, you sure are silly.
He was only a 7-year-old boy, after all, and I was solemnly discussing the oppressive nature of religious belief as if we were 2 intellectuals drinking espresso in a coffee house. Blushing at the realization of my own capacity for foolishness, I pushed aside the Uncle Wiggily board and struggled harder to make him understand why believing in such nonsense as guardian angels was not merely innocent fun, but was a step toward intellectual and emotional enslavement of a particularly pernicious sort. When he seemed alternately bored, confused, embarrassed, and utterly baffled, but never for a moment enlightened, I grew frustrated, and at last, I'm now ashamed to admit this, I made my point by taking Santa Claus away from him. Suddenly, It seemed clear to me that by allowing him to indulge in the Santa myth, I had laid the groundwork for the very irrationality that I was determined to prevent him from adopting. How could I have been so misguided as to believe that Christmas could be celebrated entirely in a secular spirit, without risk of giving credence to the religious tradition that was, after all, the genesis of the holiday? Now I saw that erecting a Christmas tree in our home and exchanging gifts, by association with such other Christmas paraphernalia as manger scenes on church lawns and trumpet-tooting plastic angels in department store decorations, had generated in Benny an assumption that the spiritual aspect of the celebration had as much validity as the materialistic aspect, which made him fertile ground for tales of guardian angels and all the other rot about sin and salvation. Under the boughs of the cherry trees, in an October breeze that was blowing us slowly toward another Christmas, I told Benny the truth about Santa Claus, explained that the gifts came from his mother and me. He protested that he had evidence of Santa's reality, the cookies and milk that he always left out for the jolly fat man and that were unfailingly consumed. I convinced him that Santa's sweet tooth was in fact my own, and that the milk, which I don't like, was always poured down the drain. Methodically, relentlessly, but with what I thought was kindness and love, I stripped from him all of the so-called magic of Christmas and left him in no doubt that the Santa stuff had been a well-meant but mistaken deception. He listened with no further protest, and when I was finished he claimed to be sleepy and in need of a nap. He rubbed his eyes and yawned elaborately. He had no more interest in Uncle Wiggily and went straight into the house and up to his room. The last thing that I said to him beneath the cherry trees was that strong, well-balanced people have no need for imaginary friends like Santa and guardian angels. All we can count on is ourselves, our friends, and our families, Benny. If we want something in life, we can't get it by asking Santa Claus, and certainly not by praying for it. We get it only by earning it, or by benefiting from the generosity of friends or relatives. There's no reason ever to wish for or pray for anything. 3 years later, when Benny was in the hospital and dying of bone cancer, I understood for the first time why other people felt the need to believe in God and seek comfort in prayer. Our lives are touched by some tragedy so enormous and so difficult to bear that the temptation to seek mystical answers to the cruelty of the world is powerful indeed. Even if we can accept that our own deaths are final, and that no souls survive the decomposition of our flesh, we often can't endure the idea that our children, when stricken in youth, are also doomed to pass from this world into no other. Children are special, so how can it be that they too will be wiped out as completely as if they had never existed? I've seen atheists, though despising religion and incapable of praying for themselves, nevertheless invoke the name of God on behalf of their seriously ill children, only to realize, sometimes with embarrassment but often with deep regret, that their philosophy denies them the foolishness of petitioning for divine intercession. When Benny was afflicted with bone cancer, I was not shaken from my convictions. Not once during the ordeal did I put principles aside and blubber at God. I was stalwart, steadfast, stoical, determined to bear the burden by myself, though there were times when the weight bowed my head and when the very bones of my shoulders felt as if they would splinter and collapse under a mountain of grief. That day in October of Benny's 7th year, as I sat beneath the cherry trees and watched him return to the house to nap, I did not know how severely my principles and self-reliance would be tested in days to come. I was proud of having freed my son of his Christmas-related fantasies about Santa Claus, and I was pompously certain that the time would come when Benny, grown to adulthood, would eventually thank me for the rigorously rational upbringing that he had received. When Hal Sheen told me that he had returned to the fold of the Catholic Church, I thought he was setting me up for a joke. We were having an after-work cocktail at a hotel bar near our offices, and I was under the impression that the purpose of our meeting was to celebrate some grand commission that Hal had won for us. "I've got news for you," he had said cryptically that morning. "Let's meet at the Regency for a drink at 6 o'clock. But instead of telling me that we had been chosen to design a building that would add another chapter to the legend of Fallon and Sheen, he told me that after more than a year of quiet debate with himself, he had shed his atheism as if it were a moldy cocoon, and had flown forth into the realm of faith once more. I laughed, waiting for the punchline, and he smiled, and in his smile there was something, perhaps pity for me, that instantly convinced me that he was serious. I argued quietly, then not so quietly. I scorned his claim to have rediscovered God, and I tried to shame him for his surrender of intellectual dignity. "I've decided a man can be both an intellectual and a practicing Christian, Jew or Buddhist," Hal said with annoying self-possession. "Impossible!" I struck our table with one fist to emphasize my rejection of that muddle-headed contention. Our cocktail glasses rattled, and an unused ashtray nearly fell to the floor, which caused other patrons to look our way. "Look at Malcolm Muggeridge," Hal said, "or C.S. Lewis, Isaac Singer, Christians and a Jew, and indisputably intellectuals." "Listen to you," I said, appalled. "On how many occasions have other people raised those names, and other names, when you and I were arguing the intellectual supremacy of atheism, and you joined me in proving what fools the Muggeridges, Lewises, and Singers of this world really are?" He shrugged. "I was wrong." "Just like that?" "No, not just like that. Give me some credit, Pete. I've spent a year reading, thinking. I've actively resisted the urge to return to the faith, and yet I've been won over." "By whom? What propagandizing priest or—"
"No person won me over. It's been entirely an interior debate, Pete. No one but me has known I've been wavering on this tightrope."
"Then what started you wavering?"
"Well, for a couple of years now, my life has been empty."
"Empty? You're young and healthy. You're married to a smart and beautiful woman. You're at the top of your profession, admired by one and all for the freshness and vigor of your architectural vision, and you're wealthy. You call that an empty life?"
He nodded. "Empty. But I couldn't figure out why. Just like you, I added up all that I've got, and it seemed like I should be the most fulfilled man on the face of the earth. But I felt hollow, and each new project we approached had less interest for me. Gradually I realized that all I'd built and that all I might build in the days to come was not going to satisfy me because the achievements were not lasting."
"Oh, sure. One of our buildings might stand for
200 years, but a couple of centuries are but a grain of sand falling in the hourglass of time. Structures of stone
and steel and glass are not enduring monuments. They're not, as we once thought, testimonies to the singular genius of mankind, rather the opposite. They're reminders that even our mightiest structures are fragile, that our greatest achievements can be quickly erased by earthquakes, wars, tidal waves, or simply by the slow gnawing of 1,000 years of sun and wind and rain. So, what's the point? The point, I reminded him angrily, is that by erecting those structures, by creating better and more beautiful buildings, we are improving the lives of our fellow men and encouraging others to reach toward higher goals of their own, and then together all of us are making a better future for the whole human species.
Yes, but to what end? He pressed.
If there's no afterlife, if each individual's existence ends entirely in the grave, then the collective fate of the species is precisely that of the individual. Death, emptiness, blackness, nothingness. Nothing can come from nothing. You can't claim a noble, higher purpose for the species as a whole when you allow no higher purpose for the individual spirit. He raised one hand to halt my response. I know. You've arguments against that statement. I've supported you in them through countless debates on the subject.
But I can't support you anymore, Pete.
I think there is some purpose to life besides just living. And if I didn't think so, then I would leave the business and spend the rest of my life having fun, enjoying the precious, finite number of days left to me. However, now that I believe there is something called a soul, and that it survives the body, I can go on working at Fallon and Sheen because it's my destiny to do so, which means the achievements can be meaningful. I hope you'll be able to accept this. I'm not going to proselytize. This is the first and last time you'll hear me mention my religion, because I'll respect your right not to believe. I'm sure we can go on as before. But we could not. I felt that religion was a hateful, degenerative sickness of the mind, and I was thereafter uncomfortable in Hal's presence. I still pretended that we were close, that nothing had changed between us, but I felt that he was